Oftentimes when I encounter Christians and I hear the arguments that are put forth for Jesus and for the resurrection, there's a lot of different approaches that they take, a lot of different apologetics, but one of the most common that I encounter is the Gary Habermas minimal facts argument. What Habermas does is he lays out a series of points that he says virtually all scholars agree on. And the 6 big ones that he lays out are that Jesus died of crucifixion, that the disciples had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. They proclaimed this event at an early date, in fact, right away. Their lives were utterly transformed by it. James became a believer after the crucifixion because of his experiences, and that Paul also became a Christian after he had an experience of the resurrected Jesus. So I want to push back against that first and see if any of these points you as a New Testament scholar would push back against and say, no, that's not the widespread consensus. But even if all of those points were widely accepted within academia, maybe we can look at an alternative hypothesis to what Habermas sees as the only possible conclusion then is that Jesus rose from the dead. First off, of those 6 points, are there any, I can go back through them, but, and if you want, you can stop me, that you would say are not universally accepted by scholars?
Jesus being crucified, I think there is pretty universal agreement on that among Western scholars. Of course, Islam takes exception to that idea. But all of our sources that we have present Jesus as crucified. I'm very keen on starting with our earliest sources and working them chronologically, because I think you see an embellishment and a development, and that's something that Habermas doesn't recognize. Now, that's hidden within those assertions, but the real stickler, I think, is when you say they quickly and soon after experienced appearances or sightings of Jesus that convinced them he was raised from the dead. I think that is something we don't have clear records on. And if I go through the texts, I hope we can do that quickly. We don't have to go into all the details. I think we're going to see that it's not so clear after all as to what happened Easter morning, let's put it that way. Ironically, I always say when I approach this subject, let's begin with our earliest eyewitness account. What would that be? Many would say, oh, you're going to start with Mark. No. Mark is not earlier than Paul, and Mark is not an eyewitness account. And I don't think Matthew or Luke is, and I don't think John is, although John does have some eyewitness material that we're going to talk about that is very important. But all of those, I think we scholars generally hold, are written after 70. And I would argue that in particular, the synoptics, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm of the view that Mark wrote first, that Matthew and Luke rewrote Mark and embellished it and expanded it. So that's something we've got to keep out there when we get to that point. But long before that, in the 50s, full 20 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, when everything just got slammed like a hammer and scattered, we've got an eyewitness testimony. If you accept the letters of Paul, even one letter, 1 Corinthians, he says, I've seen the Lord in chapter 9. I've seen the Lord being Jesus. And obviously that's after Jesus' death. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, he does a rundown of the usually translated appearances. It's actually in the passive, was seen by, so I think sightings, I think, is a better term in the modern world. I'm not going to trivialize it and say it's like sightings of Elvis or something, but I think it is the idea of someone having an experience that they interpret as from the other side, okay? And that's what Paul begins to say. And the reason I think he's talking about something different than what we find not in Mark. I think Mark we'll get to. That is our earliest synoptic account. But by the time you get to Matthew and Luke and John, you're going to see a very clear progression of additions. And that's what tangles people up, I think, evangelicals who want to defend this, because they begin to act as though these are all the same and essentially they're just different accounts. You've heard the thing about there's an auto accident and you get 5 reports and they're not all the same. That's actually not what's happening here. What's happening is rewriting and overwriting. It's a literary process that you can actually trace and see if you line them up. One is using the other and adding something, and then the next one and the next one and the next one.
So it would be more akin to if I recounted a story of an automobile accident, someone else wrote that down, and then decades after the fact, then someone else took that account and added to it later, and just so on and so forth.
So the key is Paul, really. He is the only eyewitness. In other words, there's nothing in Mark that says, and I, Mark, saw this with my own eyes, or I know Peter who saw it, and I'm testifying to this. Now, I'll get to John in a minute because it does claim that there's an eyewitness, which is most interesting. But that will be later. Let's start with our earliest witness. Paul writing in the first person. The only first-person testimony we have to the resurrection of the dead, everything else is secondary, is Paul, who said, I've seen the Lord. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, and last of all, he was cited by me, or as it's normally translated, he appeared to me. Also in Galatians 1, Paul says, when it pleased God to reveal his Son either in me or to me, okay, I did not consult with flesh and blood or talk to those who were in the movement before me, but I went away into the desert of the Arava. It's called Arabia. It's not Saudi Arabia, but down in the Negev. It's called the Arava in Hebrew. He had to get away. So what does he really say? Well, he introduces that not to prove the resurrection. He said, I experienced it. And I'm leaving out the book of Acts here. That's not Paul's firsthand testimony. It's very important to begin with the firsthand testimony. And why does he even bring this up? Because at Corinth, to whom he's writing, these Greek believers, Greek-speaking believers, some of which might have a Jewish background, but most are Gentiles or non-Jews, they're questioning, what do you mean resurrection of the dead? Like, when people die, don't their souls go to God or go to heaven? Isn't that sort of the general Hellenistic Neoplatonist view that's so common in that time? Paul has discussed that further in the second letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, that is really a composite of several letters. But in chapter 5, he explains what he means by resurrection. But let me go back to 1 Corinthians 15, and then we'll go to 2 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 15, his whole point is to tell those Corinthians, no, as Jesus died and was raised, you're going to die, or some will die, because he expects the coming, or what we call the parousia, the appearance of Jesus, to be while he's alive. He says, we who are alive will live to see it, but the dead are okay. He calls them sleeping, and they will awake from death. That is the Hebrew view of death. You're in a state called Sheol, or Hades, semi-conscious, but you're not an active being, and you don't have a body. That's the key. And he says, no, they will rise, these dead people will rise to meet Jesus. And he says they will be transformed and receive a new spiritual body. So they're bodiless and they're going to get a body. And then when he anticipates somebody's going to say, what do you mean a body? What kind of body? He says, I can't tell you what kind of body. God is going to give them a body appropriate to the event. And then he gives examples from nature, like you plant a seed and the tree that comes up or the plant that comes up is not the seed, but it comes from the seed. So he's using these analogies. I like the caterpillar and the butterfly, frankly, because we can identify, the worm goes in and makes a cocoon, tomb, and then it comes out totally different. So he's not expecting the worm to come out and fly around, so to speak, to go with that analogy. And the reason I like that is he uses the word in Greek, metamorphosis, and that's the word we use for this process of species like butterflies and moths and so forth. So he can't tell you what the body looks like. So his experience is not seeing a resuscitated human walking around after he came out of a tomb, he does mention the burial. And I personally, lots of scholars, several scholars, I shouldn't say lots, but there's a few scholars that say, well, we don't even know if he was buried. Bart Ehrman and Dom Crossan and others have said that. Others would say, well, he's buried, but then they have trouble explaining, empty tomb, which becomes one of the polemics that Gary puts forth. Well, Paul says he was buried and raised. And then he tells you, I can't tell you what the body's like. I can't describe it, but I can characterize it. It is glorious. It is powerful. It is immortal. And in his other letters, like Philippians chapter 3, I think it's verse 20 and 21, he's talking about the same event. When Christ appears in the heavens, he will transform our bodies of humiliation, our dust bodies, he calls them, flesh and blood, into like his glorious body, the body Jesus has. So body is your mode of being. When you're dead, you're simply in a holding pattern. When you're raised, according to Paul, you receive this new way of being in the world. Paul then describes it in various places as above angels. So obviously that's not a corpse walking around, even if it's been resuscitated. What's described in the Gospels, and I'll get to that, is more the idea of like Lazarus coming out of the tomb, and Jesus comes out of the tomb. And even if he seems to pass through walls or suddenly appear and disappear, that's the kind of phenomena we know in the Hebrew Bible throughout. It's called epiphany, where an angel will come and look like it's human and then it'll poof away or something like that. Paul probably believed that's possible, but that's not what he's talking about when he talks about the resurrection of Jesus. He saw or encountered in his own thinking the glorified Jesus, the heavenly Christ, with all of his power. But then he sets up this analogy of two atoms. The first atom, we are all of that atom, are of the dust. And the last atom, the final atom, which he thinks is Jesus, is of heaven or spiritual. So he actually uses the term a wind body. It's a body, but has characteristics of glory, power, and immortality that we humans as flesh and blood don't have.
Do you mind if I see if I can paraphrase or parrot this back to you to make sure I'm tracking? Mm-hmm. Based off of your book and what you're saying here, if I understand it correctly, there were two different ideas surrounding resurrection. There's the notion that maybe today we might think of where someone is, well, even today, it's like there's two different variations. One would be the physical body dies and then is called back to life, and that body stands up, and it's a reanimation of a physical corpse.
That's right. Right. Still flesh and blood.
And then you have this idea of the spirit and the flesh as two separate entities. The flesh can decay, rot away, completely disappear. We could even still find the bones later, but the spirit lives on, and it can either go on to the afterlife or it can then be reanimated into this life in some sort of spiritual body.
Exactly.
But it's not that's flesh and blood.
Now, if we go to 2 Corinthians 5, we get that explained. He uses a double analogy. Paul's good at this. He's kind of complicated, but he says, it's like a tent. So you're living in a tent. You, the real person, Thomas, you're in a tent. And that's you in the tent. The tent's not you. The tent, this is kind of platonic. The tent is your vehicle of your mode of living. You're in a tent. And then when the tent is destroyed, you get a permanent building. That would be the new body. It's still you, but now you have a new manifestation. And then he switches the analogy to clothing, which I really like. He says it's like old clothing. I like to picture it tattered and rotten and almost falling off. Like an older person, your body begins to seem like old clothing, and it finally perishes. But then you get reclothed, or it can be translated further clothed, with immortality. So it sounds Platonic, except that Plato and Socrates would say, well, what do you need the body for? You want to escape the tent, get rid of those old clothing. But Jews say, no, the body is important because they view the human person differently. And Paul is pioneering this idea. That's why the Corinthians are having a problem. So he's seen the Lord. I then would say, since he equates his sighting with those that he lists, that would be Peter and James and the 12 and all the apostles and 500 brethren at once. 500 at once. They're looking up, they're seeing something. If you go by the book of Acts, it's probably something like an intense light. But I think a voice is very important because Paul, I wrote my dissertation on Paul's ascent to paradise. He's conversational with Jesus. He calls him the Lord. He said, I asked the Lord 3 times to deliver me from this thorn in the flesh that I got from Satan when I went up to the highest heaven and saw all these amazing things. And Jesus said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. So Paul is hearing from Jesus. I don't evaluate that. I'm simply talking about what he says. You say, well, was he crazy? Was he hallucinating? Did he really see it? How would I judge that? What I can judge is what he says. He says he saw it. I think he's sincere. I don't think he's a fraud. You say, well, you think he's deceived. I'm not making a judgment on that. I'm simply saying this is what he said. You could be an evangelical Christian and go with this as long as you can go with what I'm getting ready to say about these other accounts. So he's equating his experience with the others, and he's the only one that we know who has met and talked to James and Peter. I'm talking about eyewitness. He said, I saw them. I assumed they discussed, what was your experience? What was mine? And now he goes, and last of all, I had the experience. So I'm going to say that whatever he says is the general experience of being raised from the dead is not just resuscitating a corpse. I love the book of Revelation, chapter 20. The sea gives up the dead that is in it. Are we talking about body parts here? It's a metaphor. If you die at sea, you're gone. We're not going to go find any part of you, right? If you're cremated and scattered in the wind, you're gone. So can you be resurrected? This is what the Corinthians are thinking. What do you mean a body? How are you going to get the body back? He says, no. You're thinking that this is a spiritual body that God will create and give to every human being.
So when Paul has this experience, this vision, and he sees this spiritual entity, he's basically saying that's also what the disciples experienced. And because he's the earliest testimony that we have, he's the only eyewitness testimony that we have, you're coming to the conclusion that most likely this was what everyone was experiencing, was this type of a vision, this type of a spiritual entity, and not a physical body, but that was a later addition to the texts.
Yeah, and also don't take the affirmation, well, it was only spiritual, not a real thing, as if spiritual is not real. Spiritual is more real than the physical, because the physical perishes and changes and it's transient. And he says that. Our bodies are transient. They're passing away. The outer man, he says, is passing away. The inner man, as he calls it, or person, is being renewed day by day. If you die, you then lose the old clothing, you lose the tent, but then you're reclothed or you get a permanent dwelling. And that's his essential analogy. So he builds on Platonic language, things seen, things unseen, things above, things below. But Paul would not be impressed with the resuscitation of a corpse cosmically. Now, further evidence of this is when he discusses resurrection in Romans 8 and what has happened to Jesus. He says that he's the firstborn of a family of beings called sons of God, or children. Let's be generic, children of God, offspring of God. So whatever he is, he would say, are to become. And he's the first of this new genus of beings in the universe. And then he says, and you will be above angels, and you will have the same glory as Jesus, but he's the pioneer or the first in a cosmic process. And then he says something utterly shocking. He says the actual physical creation is also going to undergo this same transformation. And he says it's been groaning in travail like a pregnant woman delivering a baby, wanting its real destiny. Now, this is so practical. We all, the world and the physical world, everything's transient, everything's passing. So he metaphorically pictures it as, what was it really created for? He mentions God created it in hope, but in hope for what? A permanent manifestation. Just as the first atom of dust is a prototype of the new atom that's going to come, that God's creating a new race, or genus is probably a better term, species. I'm not sure of my biology there, but it's a rank of beings in which he says, you lowly Corinthians with your rotting, decaying, weak bodies are going to be transformed into one of these new glorious beings. And that's what he's all fired up about. I think Paul would be, I know this is shocking, I think he would be just fine with visiting the tomb of Jesus. That would be nothing. Have you heard of the Lubavitcher Rebbe? It's a sect of Judaism. Many of his followers believe he is the Messiah. He's now died. They visit his tomb. They think he has been glorified and exalted to heaven. And when God decides to finally manifest the end. So visiting the tomb is a way of remembering the tent, right? Remembering the old clothing. But when you get your new body, you don't try to hold your old clothing and carry it around with you, or you don't need it in any way. It's gone. I think that is Paul's view. It's not Platonism.
So then where did this idea emerge from that Jesus, if this was the view and it was kind of the widely accepted view by Jesus' disciples and by Paul, where did this idea emerge then of the risen Jesus and there actually being a physical body? How did that come into play?
With that, we have to go to the texts that begin to talk about that, and I would take them pretty much in chronological order.